David Shaw here with another off-the-record story. If you want to learn more about Washington, D.C., come visit my site, offtherecordtours.com. Let's go. The Connecticut Avenue gateway to Washington, D.C. is second only to Memorial Bridge in its beauty. A broad, tree-lined street leads to this fountain that marks the boundary between Maryland and the district. But the beauty of the place is spoiled by the fountain's namesake. One of Congress's leading segregationists, Francis Newlands. You see, memorials to white supremacists aren't just found in the South. They're everywhere, like this entrance to our nation's capital. Newlands, who represented Nevada in Congress from 1898 to 1917. He's best known for the creation of the Land Reclamation Bureau, which created dams and irrigation projects out west, and being a member of the committee that investigated the Titanic sinking. Newlands was an avowed white supremacist. He wrote that African Americans were a race of children that posed a threat to the country and they should be resettled in the Caribbean. He believed that Asian immigrants would take over the West Coast, and he wrote in the New York Times that, quote, "I believe this should be a white man's country, and that we should frankly express our determination that shall be the case," end quote. Newlands doesn't make much headway in spreading his hatred legislatively, but he does get to put it into practice elsewhere. In the 1800s, he forms the Chevy Chase Land Company. No relation to this Chevy Chase.
Many of you don't know that Fred was darn near death recently, and he wasn't ashamed to admit to me that he'd had syphilis, and thank God he stopped in his tracks.
And buys nearly 2,000 acres of farmland here and creates the D.C. neighborhood of Chevy Chase and the adjoining town of Chevy Chase, Maryland. Newlands does not put any restrictions on who can live in these neighborhoods. It's much more clever than that. Instead, he requires that any construction must be detached, single-family houses costing no less than $3,000. This requirement makes building out of reach of anyone but the most wealthy. In 1906, when a black developer wanted to build a subdivision in Chevy Chase for African Americans, the land company blocks it in court, saying that the developer was committing fraud by planning to sell lots to Negroes. And by the 1920s, segregation was hardwired into the neighborhoods, with covenants in Chevy Chase deeds preventing the sale of houses to blacks and Jews. Newland dies in 1917 when what little heart he had failed. Mrs. Newland thought so much of her dear husband that she spent $12,000 to build this fountain in his memory. It's erected in 1938. Today, Chevy Chase, Maryland is home to such illustrious folks like talking head George Will, Federal Reserve Bank Chairman Jerome Powell, and Supreme Court Justices John Roberts and Brent Kavanaugh. In fact, Mrs. Kavanaugh used to work as the Chevy Chase, Maryland's town manager. The Chevy Chase Land Company is still in business, and Newland's segregation legacy continues. The requirement of building single-family houses is still a well-used zoning method to keep this and neighborhoods around the country segregated to this day. In 2020, neighbors asked the Park Service to remove the plaque commemorating Newlands. To date, no action has been taken. Well, I hope you enjoyed that off-the-record story. If you want to learn more about Washington, D.C., things seen and unseen, arrange your tour of your nation's capital at offtherecordtours.com. Until then, I'm David Shaw.